In this hard-hitting, controversial video, we dive deep into the geopolitical realities behind accusations that the United States and Israel are the biggest state-sponsored terrorist organizations in the world. Drawing on historical facts, military actions, and the ongoing conflicts in the Middle East, this video exposes the truth behind US foreign policies and Israel's actions in Palestine. Are these nations responsible for systemic violence and the repression of entire populations? Can their military interventions and occupation policies be considered acts of terrorism? Watch to understand the deeper complexities of global power, media bias, and the impact on civilians in Gaza, Iraq, Lebanon, and beyond. And also analyze what is the real definition of terrorism according to the UN and, unfortunately, how the USA government and Israel fit exactly in it. We explore the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories, US. Military interventions in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other regions, the role of the US. In supporting Israel's military actions. Media bias in portraying Israel and the United States in global conflicts. The humanitarian crises caused by their foreign policies. This video sheds light on the often overlooked consequences of global superpower actions and challenges the mainstream narrative. Stay informed and uncover the truths that shape our world. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more in-depth geopolitical analysis. Also, my dear victims of the West, share as much as possible to join our new freedom movement for expelling those hypocrite terrorists out of our lands. The claim that the United States and Israel are the biggest terrorist organizations on earth is rooted in a specific, controversial perspective that views these nations' military, foreign policy, and political actions as forms of state terrorism. While this perspective is far from universally accepted and indeed is highly contested, proponents of this view argue that both the United States and Israel, through their historical and ongoing actions, engage in systematic violence and repression that meets the criteria of terrorism. These claims often arise from deeply emotional and politicized contexts, particularly in relation to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, United States interventions in the Middle East, and broader geopolitical struggles. To explore this argument in depth, it is essential to consider both the historical and contemporary actions of the United States and Israel, how their policies have affected global conflicts, and why some critics label them as terrorist organizations. This analysis will also need to examine definitions of terrorism, the power dynamics at play, and the broader geopolitical context in which these allegations arise. Defining terrorism. Before delving into specific claims, it is essential to clarify what is meant by terrorism. Generally, terrorism is defined as the use of violence or the threat of violence to achieve political, religious, or ideological objectives, typically targeting civilians to instill fear. International law and human rights organizations have long debated the precise definition, especially when it comes to distinguishing between terrorism and legitimate armed resistance. From this perspective, those accusing the United States and Israel of terrorism argue that these nations, through their military interventions, occupations, and support of oppressive regimes, employ systematic violence for political gain. Critics argue that the scale of violence, its targets, often civilians, and the long-term consequences of these actions render these states guilty of terrorism under this definition. Foreign policy and accusations of terrorism. The United States has been a dominant global power since the mid-20th century, and its foreign policy has shaped numerous conflicts around the world. Those who accuse the US of state terrorism point to several key areas. 1. Interventions in the Middle East. US military interventions in Iraq in 1991 and 2003, Afghanistan in 2001, and various operations in Syria, Libya, and Yemen have been characterized by critics as acts of imperial aggression rather than legitimate self-defense or efforts to promote democracy. The civilian toll of these wars, which includes hundreds of thousands of deaths, has led some to argue that these interventions amount to terrorism due to the widespread fear and suffering they cause among civilian populations. The use of drone strikes, which often result in the deaths of civilians, further fuels this argument. 2. Support for authoritarian regimes. Throughout the Cold War and beyond, the US supported numerous authoritarian regimes, many of which were responsible for widespread human rights abuses. Examples include US support for dictatorships in Latin America, such as Chile under Pinochet, and Argentina during its Dirty War, the Shah of Iran, and more recently, Saudi Arabia. Critics argue that by backing these regimes, the US enabled state terrorism against civilian populations. 3. The war on terror and global surveillance. The US's war on terror following the 9/11 attacks has been a source of significant controversy. The invasion of Iraq under false pretenses, the abuses in Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo Bay, and the systematic use of surveillance both domestically and internationally are seen by many as acts of terror themselves, implemented under the guise of counterterrorism. From this perspective, the US is accused of using its military and intelligence power not only to combat terrorism, but also to enforce its hegemony, control resources, particularly oil in the Middle East, and suppress movements that challenge its geopolitical dominance. The human cost of these actions, including the deaths of civilians, destruction of infrastructure, and creation of refugees, is cited as evidence of state terrorism. Israel and accusations of state terrorism. The accusations against Israel, particularly concerning its role in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, are among the most hotly debated topics in international politics. Israel is often accused of engaging in state terrorism through its occupation of Palestinian territories, its military actions in Gaza and the West Bank, and its broader treatment of Palestinians. Key arguments include: 1. Occupation of Palestinian territories. Since the 1967 Six-Day War, Israel has occupied the West Bank and Gaza Strip, territories that Palestinians claim as part of their future state. The Israeli settlement policy, which involves the establishment of Jewish settlements in these occupied territories, is widely regarded as illegal under international law and as an act of aggression. Critics argue that the occupation itself is a form of state terrorism, as it involves the systematic oppression of the Palestinian population, including home demolitions, military checkpoints, and restrictions on movement. 2. Military actions in Gaza. Israel's military operations in Gaza, particularly those in 2008 to 2009, 2012, 2014, and 2021, have resulted in the deaths of thousands of Palestinians, many of whom were civilians. Critics argue that Israel's use of overwhelming military force, including airstrikes on densely populated civilian areas, constitutes terrorism. The blockade of Gaza, which severely restricts the movement of people and goods, is seen by many as collective punishment, a violation of international law, and an act of terror against the civilian population. 3. Apartheid allegations. Numerous human rights organizations, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, have accused Israel of practicing apartheid, a system of institutionalized racial segregation and discrimination. These accusations are based on Israel's policies in the occupied territories, where Palestinians are subject to different laws and face restrictions on their movement, access to resources, and political rights. Critics argue that this system of control amounts to state terrorism, as it is designed to subjugate an entire population through fear and violence. 4. Treatment of Palestinian protesters. Israel's response to Palestinian protests, particularly during the Great March of Return in 2018, has been heavily criticized. Israeli forces killed over 200 Palestinians and injured thousands more, including medics and journalists. Critics argue that the use of live ammunition against unarmed protesters constitutes terrorism, as it is intended to instill fear and suppress legitimate political dissent. The role of the United States in supporting Israel. A key aspect of the argument that the United States and Israel are the biggest terrorist organizations on earth is the close alliance between the two countries. The United States provides Israel with significant military and financial support, amounting to billions of dollars annually. This support has enabled Israel to maintain its occupation of Palestinian territories and to carry out military operations with impunity. Critics argue that the United States is complicit in Israel's actions and is, therefore, also responsible for the alleged acts of state terrorism committed by Israel. The United States has used its veto power in the United Nations Security Council to block resolutions condemning Israel's actions, further cementing its role as an enabler of Israeli aggression. Additionally, United States military aid to Israel has been used to fund the development of advanced weaponry, including drones and missile defense systems, which critics argue are used to maintain Israel's dominance over the Palestinians. Double standards and the Western media. The portrayal of the United States and Israel in Western media is another critical factor in the argument that these nations are engaged in terrorism. Critics argue that Western media outlets, particularly those in the United States and Europe, are biased in favor of Israel and tend to downplay or justify its actions. Similarly, United States military interventions are often portrayed as necessary for national security or as efforts to spread democracy rather than as acts of aggression. This double standard is seen as a form of propaganda, designed to legitimize the actions of the United States and Israel while demonizing their opponents. For example, Palestinian resistance groups like Hamas are labeled as terrorists, while Israeli military actions that result in far greater civilian casualties are described as self-defense. This narrative, critics argue, serves to obscure the reality of state terrorism carried out by the United States and Israel. The humanitarian impact. One of the most compelling arguments made by critics is the humanitarian toll of United States and Israeli actions. The wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and Yemen, as well as the ongoing conflict in Palestine, have resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of civilians, the displacement of millions, and the destruction of entire cities and communities. The long-term consequences of these conflicts, including the rise of extremist groups like ISIS, are often cited as further evidence that United States and Israeli policies are not just acts of state terrorism, but also contribute to global instability and violence. The blockade of Gaza, for example, has created a humanitarian crisis with limited access to clean water, electricity, and medical supplies. The United States' sanctions on countries like Iran and Venezuela, which are often described as tools of foreign policy, are also seen by some as acts of economic terrorism, as they disproportionately harm civilian populations and lead to widespread suffering. Conclusion. The argument that the United States and Israel are the biggest terrorist organizations on earth is not so controversial. Ultimately, whether one agrees with this characterization or not, it is clear that the actions of the United States and Israel have had profound and far-reaching consequences for global peace and security. The deaths of civilians, the destruction of infrastructure, and the long-term destabilization of entire regions are undeniable. And these realities must be reckoned with when discussing the morality and legality of United States and Israeli policies. Critics who label these nations as the biggest terrorist organizations emphasize that the scale of violence, the targeting of civilian populations, and the far-reaching impacts of their actions meet the criteria for terrorism under international law. They argue that state terrorism, when perpetrated by powerful nations, is often overlooked or justified by global institutions and media, thereby enabling continued violence and repression. In conclusion, while the designation of the United States and Israel as terrorist organizations remains big questions on Western propagandists' media, but it's a reality. Read the UN Charter defining terrorism and terrorists. UN stance on terrorism comes from the UN Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy, 2006, which condemns terrorism in all its forms and manifestations, committed by whomever, wherever, and for whatever purposes. Key elements in UN efforts to define terrorism. 1. General Assembly Resolution 4960, 1994. This resolution condemns terrorism without offering a specific definition. However, it outlines acts of terrorism as criminal acts intended or calculated to provoke a state of terror in the general public, a group of persons or particular persons for political purposes. 2. Security Council Resolutions. Resolution 1566, 2004. This resolution indirectly touches upon defining terrorism by describing it as criminal acts, including against civilians, committed with the intent to cause death or serious bodily injury, or taking hostages with the purpose to provoke a state of terror, intimidate a population, or compel a government or an international organization to do or abstain from doing any act. 3. UN Special Rapporteur on Counter-Terrorism. This body has emphasized that defining terrorism should include 3 key elements: the intention to cause death or serious bodily injury, the aim of intimidating a population or compelling a government or organization, a political, religious, or ideological motivation. Now tell guys which organizations do the above acts. Obviously, needless to say, it's only Israel and United States government, not United States citizens. So it highlights the profound moral and ethical dilemmas surrounding state-sponsored violence. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, United States interventions in the Middle East, and the humanitarian crises that have followed are stark reminders of the destructive power wielded by nation-states in pursuit of their strategic interests. Understanding these critiques is essential for fostering a more nuanced and honest dialogue about global justice, accountability, and the future of peace in regions ravaged by decades of conflict.